The house had settled into silence, the kind that only came after decades of marriage. Two people who no longer needed to speak every hour to feel each other's presence. Margaret sat curled on the sofa with a blanket, half asleep when the sound came. 3 sharp knocks that rattled the front door. She startled. At this hour, the clock above the mantel glowed 11:57 p.m. David, her husband, had been dozing in his armchair. He stirred, rubbing his temples, muttering that he'd get it. The second round of knocks came louder, more insistent. Margaret's chest tightened. She watched David cross the room, his posture stiff, as though he already knew who stood on the other side. When the door opened, the night air spilled in, cold and heavy. 2 men in dark suits stood beneath the porch light, their badges raised. FBI, one of them said, his voice clipped. "We need to speak with David Hale." Her husband froze. The blood drained from his face so quickly Margaret thought he might faint. He didn't ask why they were here, didn't protest. He simply swallowed hard, his eyes flickering toward her before dropping to the floor. "What is this about?" Margaret managed, her voice shaking. The taller agent glanced at her but kept his focus on David. "Sir, we need you to come with us. There are questions you must answer." David's lips moved soundlessly at first. Then, almost under his breath, he whispered, "It was always going to end this way." The words hung between them, slicing through the stillness. Margaret felt her stomach twist. She wanted to demand an explanation, to scream, but the weight in David's eyes stopped her. It wasn't confusion she saw. It was resignation. The agents stepped inside, filling the hallway with their presence. Margaret could hear the faint rustle of papers, the metallic jingle of handcuffs clipped to a belt. David lifted his hands slightly, not resisting, not arguing. Margaret stood rooted to the carpet, heart hammering as the reality pressed in. The man she had built a life with for 40 years wasn't fighting to prove himself innocent. He was surrendering, and with that surrender, a question bloomed like poison in her chest. What had he done? The echo of David's whispered words, "It was always going to end this way," lingered long after the agents left. Margaret sat motionless in the living room, the blanket still bunched around her knees, staring at the closed door as though it had swallowed her life whole. This was her husband, David Hale, the man who made her coffee every morning, who planted roses along the back fence because she loved their scent, the man who, for 40 years, had been steady, predictable hers. She clung to that image as though it could shield her from the dread gnawing inside. Their life together had been a quiet one, rooted in routine. Saturday mornings at the farmer's market. Evening walks, his hand always warm against hers. Holidays spent at their daughter's house, where David would carve the turkey while everyone teased him for telling the same old jokes. He was gentle, ordinary, safe. But now the ordinary felt like a mask. The way he'd gone pale at the door, the resignation in his voice. Had she been blind all these years? Her mind reached back, searching for cracks she might have ignored. There were nights when he'd stayed in the basement longer than seemed normal. Trips for work he never explained in detail. A single argument years ago when she asked about a box he kept locked in his workshop. His sudden anger had startled her. She'd let it go, telling herself every marriage carried its mysteries. Margaret rose, pacing the room. Every framed photograph of their life together now felt like a question. Was the smile on their wedding day real? Were the tender looks he gave her across the dinner table genuine or carefully rehearsed? She tried to summon anger but found only confusion, a sickening swirl of love and doubt. After decades of intimacy, she could still feel the weight of his arm around her shoulders, still hear the way he whispered her name in the dark. And yet the man who whispered those words tonight was not the man she thought she knew. Margaret's breath trembled as she whispered into the silence. "Who are you, David?" Upstairs the floor creaked, the sound of him moving about, avoiding her questions, avoiding her eyes. The next morning the house felt stripped of its warmth. Margaret woke to the sound of tires crunching against the driveway. The same agents stood outside, silhouettes against the pale dawn. This time they did not linger at the door. They entered with the authority of men who knew they were no longer guests. "Mr. Hale, you'll need to come with us," the taller agent said. David didn't argue. He simply took his jacket from the hook, slipping it on with mechanical precision. For a fleeting second his gaze brushed against Margaret's, and she thought she saw apology in his eyes. No words, only that silent acknowledgement, before he stepped past her and disappeared with them. Margaret's hands trembled as the screen door clattered shut. The agents had left her behind, but not without leaving fragments sharp enough to cut through the marrow of her life. "Your husband has lived under another name," one said quietly, perhaps pitying her confusion. "There are records, but you'll need to hear it from him. He's been connected to an unsolved case dating back to 1978. She swallowed hard, shaking her head. "That's impossible. You must have the wrong man. My husband is David Hale. He was born in Ohio. The agent's eyes softened, but his tone remained firm. "Ma'am, people can live entire lives under names that aren't theirs." And just like that, the house that had always been her sanctuary felt alien. She sat alone at the kitchen table after they left, the ticking clock growing louder by the second. Her mind spiraled back through the years, replaying moments that once seemed trivial, but now burned with hidden meaning. The way David hated photographs from his youth. The rare occasions when someone called the house and he answered, only to hang up abruptly if she walked into the room. The unease in his voice when she once asked if he'd ever been in trouble with the law. He'd smiled then, pulling her close, whispering, "You worry too much, Maggie." How many times had he soothed her doubts with that phrase? How many truths had he buried under his calm demeanor? Margaret pressed her palms to her temples, refusing to believe the man she loved could be a fugitive with a violent past. Yet the silence of the house seemed to mock her, whispering that love had blinded her for far too long. A sudden memory surfaced, his locked box in the basement, the one she never touched. For the first time, she felt an urgent need to open it. Margaret's gaze drifted toward the basement door, but fear kept her rooted in place. The agent's words echoed through her skull, another name, a violent past. She shook her head, whispering to herself that it wasn't true. Yet the longer she sat in the silence, the more the house seemed to hum with secrets she had ignored for decades. By mid-afternoon, she couldn't bear it any longer. She began searching. It started innocently. Drawers in the study, shelves in the den. She sifted through bills, tax returns, birthday cards from their grandchildren, all the expected tokens of a shared life. But as she reached the back of his desk, her hand brushed a drawer that resisted. Locked. Her pulse quickened. David had never kept anything locked from her. Not that she had noticed. She tugged harder, but it wouldn't budge. Margaret stood staring at it, the small brass keyhole gleaming like an accusation. Leaving it, she moved upstairs, pulling boxes from closets, her movements sharper now, more frantic. Dust clung to her hands as she opened one carton after another, her breath growing shallow with each reveal. In the back of their bedroom closet, behind his winter coats, she uncovered a small leather-bound album. At first glance, the photographs inside appeared ordinary. Family gatherings, vacations. David smiling stiffly beside her. But wedged between the pages were older, faded photographs. David, younger, standing with people she didn't recognize. In one, his arm draped around a dark-haired woman, his smile unguarded in a way she had never seen. Margaret's throat tightened. She flipped the photo over and froze at the scrawled handwriting. E.H. Summer 78. Beneath the album lay a stack of yellowed envelopes. She unfolded one carefully, her hands trembling. The handwriting inside was elegant, flowing, clearly not David's. "You promised me forever, Daniel." Daniel. The name clawed at her, unfamiliar yet chilling. Her knees weakened and she sat heavily on the bed, the letters spilling across her lap. Every word, every faded photograph carved a deeper crack in the man she thought she knew. The walls seemed to close in around her, heavy with whispers she could no longer ignore. Somewhere in this house lay the truth, hidden deliberately, waiting for her to unearth it. Her eyes shifted back to the locked drawer downstairs. The letters still lay scattered on Margaret's lap when the knock returned. Sharper this time, deliberate. She startled, clutching them to her chest as though the paper itself were incriminating. When she opened the door, a single agent stood waiting. He introduced himself as Agent Keller, his expression measured, his eyes scanning her face for cracks. "Mrs. Hale," he began, voice low. "I need to speak with you privately. May I come in?" Margaret hesitated, torn between fear and a desperate need for clarity. At last she stepped aside. Keller entered, removing his hat as though the gesture might soften the weight of what he carried. They sat in the living room, the air thick with unspoken dread. Keller's gaze flickered toward the letters clutched tightly in her hands. "I see you've already found some of it," he said quietly. Margaret's throat tightened. "Found what? Who was she? Who is E.H.?" Keller leaned forward, his voice steady but heavy. "Mrs. Hale, your husband, the man you know as David Hale, he isn't who he claims to be. His real name is Elias Monroe. He's been living under this false identity for nearly 5 decades. Margaret felt her pulse hammer in her ears. "No," she whispered. "That's not possible. David was born in Ohio. I met his parents." "They weren't his parents," Keller interrupted gently. "They were part of the cover. He's wanted for questioning in connection to the murder of a woman named Evelyn Hart in 1978. She was found strangled in a motel room. Every piece of evidence pointed to Elias Monroe, your husband. But he vanished before charges could be filed. The name struck her like a blade. Evelyn Hart, E.H. The woman in the faded photograph. Margaret shook her head violently. "You're wrong. He's a good man. He raised children, built a home, never once laid a hand on me. He couldn't." Keller's tone softened, but his words didn't. "I understand this is devastating, but people are not always who we believe them to be. Sometimes they bury their sins so deeply that even those closest never see them." Margaret looked down at the letters trembling in her hands. "You promised me forever, Daniel." Only now she knew Daniel wasn't real. David wasn't real. Elias Monroe had been the ghost haunting her marriage all along. Keller rose, leaving her with one final sentence. "The truth always surfaces. Mrs. Hale, it's only a matter of whether you choose to face it." Margaret sat frozen, the room spinning. Her entire life reduced to a lie. The county jail visitation room smelled of bleach and cold metal. Margaret sat at a narrow table, her hands clenched together, staring at the reinforced glass. When David, Elias Daniel, whoever he was led in, she almost didn't recognize him. His shoulders slumped, his face drawn tight, but his eyes carried the same warmth she'd known for 40 years. That was what made it unbearable. "Margaret," he said softly as he sat across from her. His voice cracked but then steadied into the familiar tone he had always used when calming her. "Don't believe what they're saying. It's all a mistake. You know me." She wanted to scream at him, demand answers, but the words stuck. Instead, she whispered, "They told me your name is Elias Monroe. That Evelyn Hart was—" "Stop." His voice sharpened, then softened again, as though he caught himself. "They're twisting things. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, that's all. I didn't kill anyone. I ran because I was scared. But you—" He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "You know who I am. You've lived with me. You've seen me. Am I a murderer to you?" Margaret's throat closed. She wanted to say no, but the image of Evelyn's photograph burned in her mind. "You remember our life," he pressed on. "The roses, the children, every Sunday morning. That's real. That's me. They're trying to rip that away from us. Don't let them." His words wound around her like a net, tugging at every memory they'd shared. She thought of the mornings when he'd kissed her cheek before work, the way he'd held her when her mother died. Could a man who loved her so faithfully harbor something so monstrous? David reached a hand against the glass, palm flat. "All I've ever asked from you is trust, Maggie. Haven't I earned that?" Her chest ached as she lifted her hand, hovering inches from his. Yet as she stared into his pleading eyes, she felt the subtle pull of something darker, an invisible rope tightening, binding her to his version of the truth. For the first time, Margaret wondered if love itself had been his greatest weapon. Margaret hadn't slept in days. David's voice, "Trust me, Maggie, you know me," still clung to her like smoke. She replayed it endlessly, trying to decide if it was love speaking or manipulation. The uncertainty hollowed her out. Then came another knock. This one was softer, hesitant. When Margaret opened the door, a woman stood on the porch, her posture rigid, her eyes fierce despite the lines etched by time. She introduced herself in a voice that carried both steel and sorrow. "My name is Claire Hart," she said. "Evelyn Hart was my sister." The name hit Margaret like a blow. She let Claire inside, her hands trembling as she gestured toward the living room. They sat across from each other, the silence between them heavy with unspoken accusations. "I've waited 47 years for this," Claire began, her voice low, deliberate. "I never married. Never had children. My life stopped the night my sisters did. And all that time, while I buried my parents and grew old alone, he was here, building a family, pretending to be someone else." Margaret's chest tightened. She wanted to protest, to defend David, but the conviction in Claire's eyes silenced her. Claire opened her purse and pulled out a worn folder. Inside were photographs, Evelyn, vibrant and smiling, hair catching the sunlight. "She was only 22, Claire whispered, her voice cracking. "Full of plans." She trusted him, and he killed her for it. Margaret stared at the images. Evelyn's face was hauntingly familiar, the same woman she had seen in the faded photograph upstairs. The resemblance to David in those younger days was undeniable. "I've spent decades writing letters to police, begging them not to forget her," Claire continued. "They told me there wasn't enough evidence, that Elias Monroe vanished too cleanly, and all this time he was living under your roof." Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth, nausea rising. She thought of birthdays, Christmas dinners, quiet nights reading side by side. Could all of that have been stolen from another woman's future? "You loved him," Claire said softly, almost pitying. "I can see that. But I need you to love the truth more. I need you to stand with me, not with the man who strangled my sister." Margaret's eyes stung with tears. She felt torn in two, between the life she had built with David and the broken life Claire had been left with. When Claire finally left, the photographs remained on the coffee table, Evelyn's smile staring up at her. Margaret realized she was no longer just a wife. She was the keeper of another woman's justice. After Claire left, the house felt suffocating. Margaret wandered from room to room, unable to sit still. The photographs of Evelyn still lay on the table, her smile like an accusation Margaret couldn't look away from. She turned toward the mirror in the hallway, catching her own reflection. For a moment she didn't recognize the woman staring back. Hollow eyes, lips pressed tight, as though her life had been drained of color. Her thoughts spiraled backward. Every year of her marriage replayed like broken film, but now the frames looked different. David's sudden business trips that never quite added up. His refusal to attend reunions with old friends. The way he always grew tense when police cars drove past. How had she dismissed those things? She had chalked them up to quirks, harmless anxieties. But with Claire's words echoing in her mind, they were no longer harmless. They were warnings she had ignored. She remembered a night years ago when David had come home late, his shirt rumpled, a faint cut on his knuckle. She'd asked what happened and he'd smiled, pulling her close, murmuring, "Just clumsy, Maggie. You know me?" She had laughed, kissed the scrape, and let the explanation slide. Another night resurfaced, when she had stumbled upon him burning papers in the fireplace. He told her they were just old bills. She hadn't asked further. Margaret pressed her hands to her temples, heart pounding. How much of my life was a lie? Devotion pulled her one way, the memories of shared joy, of his gentle hand brushing her cheek when she cried, of the man who seemed incapable of cruelty. But betrayal tugged harder now, whispering that she had been nothing more than cover, a shield against his past. Her reflection blurred through tears. She had stood by him for decades, building a family, trusting the life they'd made together. But as she looked into her own eyes in the mirror, she wondered if she had been complicit all along, choosing not to see what was right before her. The mirror fractured her image into doubt and dread. She whispered to the empty house, "Who was I married to?" And somewhere deep inside, she knew the only way forward was to confront the truth herself. The courthouse smelled of dust and old wood polish, its walls heavy with history and judgment. Margaret sat in the gallery, her hands folded tightly in her lap, while Elias, was led into the courtroom in shackles. He kept his gaze forward, never turning to meet hers. The judge called the case. The State versus Elias Monroe. The name sliced through her chest. No trace of David Hale remained here. The prosecution wasted no time. Photographs were projected on a screen. Black and white crime scene images from 1978. Margaret forced herself to look, but immediately wished she hadn't. Evelyn Hart's body sprawled across a motel bed, bruises staining her neck. Margaret's stomach clenched. A witness took the stand, a retired motel clerk, his voice raspy with age. "I saw him that night," he said, pointing a shaking finger at David. "He checked in under a false name. She was alive when they went in. Only he came out." Margaret's breath caught. She remembered evenings when David had told her he despised motels, insisting they were dirty places. Was it aversion or guilt? Next came a forensic analyst. Fingerprints lifted from a glass in the motel room matched Elias Monroe. Technology wasn't advanced enough then, but with today's databases, the match is undeniable. The courtroom buzzed. Margaret's nails dug into her palms. Every piece of evidence piled against him, a wall she could no longer scale with denial. Claire sat in the front row, her hands clenched around a photograph of Evelyn. Her shoulders trembled, but her gaze never left David. Margaret felt a strange solidarity with her. Two women bound by the same man, in opposite, devastating ways. Finally, the prosecution presented a small velvet pouch. Inside lay Evelyn's jewelry, earrings Margaret herself had seen in David's locked chest in the basement. The prosecutor's voice was cold. Trophies kept for decades hidden away like ghosts he couldn't let go. Margaret closed her eyes. A sob caught in her throat. She remembered finding them, convincing herself there was another explanation. There wasn't. When the defense rose, David spoke at last. His voice carried through the room, calm, almost tender. "I loved Evelyn. I never killed her. I ran because I was scared. Haven't you ever run from something you couldn't face?" His eyes flicked toward Margaret, pleading. But Margaret no longer knew if those words were love or poison. Each testimony buried her marriage deeper, until she realized it was already a corpse. The jail's visiting room was colder than Margaret expected, its fluorescent lights humming with a lifeless rhythm. A metal table separated her from David, shackled at the wrists, his once steady hands now trembling against the steel. For the first time, he looked smaller, diminished, as though truth itself had stripped away the man she thought she knew. She almost turned away, but his voice, hoarse, broken, stopped her. "Margaret, please. Just listen." Her chest tightened. "Why should I?" she asked. "Every word out of your mouth has been a lie." David lowered his head, then raised it with eyes that glistened. "Because I don't have the strength to lie anymore." His voice cracked. "Yes, I killed her." The words slammed into Margaret like a blow. She gripped the edge of the chair to steady herself. He went on, his confession pouring out like water from a breached dam. "It was an argument. I lost control. Evelyn threatened to expose me and I snapped. By the time I realized what I'd done, it was too late. I panicked, I ran, and when I became David Hale, when I met you," his eyes softened, desperate, "I thought I could bury Elias Monroe forever." Margaret's throat tightened with nausea. "You buried her instead. I loved you," he said, chains rattling as he leaned forward. "Everything I built, every lie I told, it was for you. To protect the life we had." His face twisted in anguish. "I was terrified that if you knew the truth, you'd leave. I couldn't survive that." She shook her head, tears spilling freely now. "So you manipulated me? Trapped me inside a story that was never real. You didn't protect me, David, you imprisoned me." Silence pressed between them, thick and unbearable. He bowed his head again, and for once there was no defiance in him, no carefully constructed defense, only a man hollowed out by guilt. Margaret stared at the stranger across the table. He had confessed, yes, but his words were poisoned with a plea for absolution she could never give. When the guard came to take him away, Margaret stood on trembling legs. His whispered words followed her. "I did it all for love." But love, she thought bitterly, should never smell like blood. Margaret drove home from the jail in silence, the night pressing against her windshield like a suffocating shroud. David's words, "I did it all for love," clung to her ears, echoing over the hum of the engine. Love, the very thing she had believed sustained their marriage, now felt like a weapon that had cut her deeply without her ever noticing. Inside the house, everything looked the same. Photographs lining the mantel, his slippers still tucked neatly under the chair, the faint smell of his aftershave lingering in the air. But now each detail mocked her. She had lived here for decades, shoulder to shoulder with a murderer, and never truly seen him. She sank onto the couch, her body folding inward. Images surfaced, The locked drawers she never forced open. The stories she accepted without question. The bruised knuckle she kissed away as if it meant nothing. She had called it trust, called it love. But was it willful blindness? Did she choose ignorance because it was easier than doubt? Her hands shook as she held a photo of their wedding day. There she was in white, radiant with promise, clinging to the man who smiled at her as though she were his salvation. She traced the edges of his face with her finger and whispered, "I should have asked. I should have known." The weight of complicity settled heavy on her chest. Though she had not wielded the knife, she had helped keep the truth buried. By never digging, by never daring to confront the inconsistencies, the silence of her marriage had been as damning as his lies. She thought of Claire, who had spent decades clawing for justice. Margaret, by contrast, had been the unwitting accomplice, the quiet keeper of his false identity, her reflection caught in the darkened window, pale and trembling. She saw not a wife but a witness, and that terrified her most of all. Margaret realized then that justice was no longer only about David. It was about her. About whether she would keep living under the weight of silence, or finally speak the truth she had avoided for 47 years. She pressed the wedding photo flat against her chest, her tears soaking into its frame. In that moment she knew, if he was buried by his crime, then she too was buried by her silence. The trial ended, the sentence handed down, and David, or Elias, as the world now named him, was locked away. The courthouse emptied, the news vans drove off, and life in the small town stumbled forward. But Margaret's life did not. She returned to the house that night, unlocking the door with hands that trembled, stepping into a silence that seemed to echo louder than any crowd. For the first time in decades, the rooms were hers alone. No hum of David's radio drifting from the den. No shuffle of slippers on the hardwood. Just absence, thick and suffocating. On the dining table lay the FBI's files left behind after weeks of interrogations. Stamped pages, witness statements, photographs yellowed with time. She traced her hand over them, almost afraid to touch. Each sheet carried a fragment of a man she never truly knew. Elias Monroe, fugitive, murderer, master of reinvention. Margaret sank into a chair, the weight of years pressing down on her shoulders. 47 years. That was how long she had loved a ghost. How long she had laughed, argued, and grown old beside a man whose name was a lie. She thought of their anniversaries, the trips they had taken, the quiet nights by the fire. Were they moments of love, or rehearsed illusions to hide a crime? The clock ticked on the wall, each second dragging her deeper into the cavern of doubt. She lifted one of the faded photographs from the file. Evelyn, the murdered woman. Young, smiling, eyes full of a life cut short. Margaret whispered an apology into the empty room. Her gaze drifted to the wedding photo still standing on the mantel. Two images stared back at her now. Evelyn, forever frozen in youth, and herself frozen in blindness. Both victims of Elias Monroe. Tears stung her eyes as she rose, walking through the house, touching the walls as if searching for reassurance. But the walls only whispered secrets she could no longer ignore. At the doorway, she stopped, her voice trembling into the hollow air. "I was married to a ghost." The words lingered heavy and final. The truth was hers to carry now, a legacy etched not in love but in betrayal. And in that silence, Margaret understood. Some hauntings are not of the dead, but of the living who deceived us.